Hello, I'm Mark Tallman with the Kansas Association of School Boards. One of the most frequent questions we get is about educational attainment and standards in Kansas. How have they changed? How do they compare to the past? How do they compare to other states? To help answer some of those questions, I'm going to share a presentation I made to the Kansas State Board of Education in April of 2019. Let's start by looking at the Kansas Constitution, because this tells us what the people of Kansas has set as expectations for their school system. The Education Article, Article 6, begins with a section that says, "The legislature shall provide for intellectual, educational, vocational, and scientific improvement by establishing and maintaining public schools and other educational institutions." In other words, the people have said the purpose of public education is to improve education in the state. In addition, the Kansas Supreme Court has defined suitable funding as that which is necessary to allow schools and students to meet what are called the Rose capacities. There are 7 different Rose capacities, and the final 2 really talk about preparation for life after they leave the school system. Number 6 talks about sufficient training or preparation for advanced training in either academic or vocational fields to allow each child to choose and pursue life work intelligently. And the final standard talks about sufficient levels of academic or vocational skills so each public school student can compete favorably with counterparts in surrounding states in academics or in the job market. In other words, we need to be preparing students to be successful whether they go on to college, whether they go into further training, post-secondary training, and to compete favorably with students from other states. So based on those standards, how are we doing? Well, the first one talks about the need to improve education levels in our population. Let's start by looking at U.S. Census data for the population aged 24 and over in Kansas and the rest of the country. In 1940, when this data first started being collected and reported, less than 1/3, less than 30% actually, of Kansans over age 24 had completed 12 years of schooling. By 2017, that had reached 90%, and it's topped the U.S. average every census decade since the beginning. The other education measure that has been collected since 1940 is the percent of population with 4-year college degrees, a bachelor's degree or higher. Back in 1940, less than 5% of the population of both Kansas and the United States as a whole had completed this credential. By 2017, in Kansas, it had reached almost 35%, most of this time topping the national average. So the percent of our population completing a 4-year degree has increased 6 times over since 1940. Now let's look at things a little more recently and in a little more detail. We'll go back to 1990, about 25 years ago. What we've seen is that the percent of the Kansas population completing high school has increased from a little over 81% to over 90% in that 25-year period. Every major racial ethnic group within the population has also shown improvement over that period of time. Improvement has been even more dramatic for 4-year degree completion. In the last roughly 25 years, the percent of Kansans 25 and older with a 4-year degree has increased from about 1 in 5 to 1 in 3. And again, each major population group within Kansas has shown improvement. For example, Black college attainment has over doubled in that period. Those numbers are for the population over 25 and older. Let's look at the population a little closer to the educational system. What's been happening for the age group that has most recently left our K-12 system? We've got data back to 2005 for the population group age 18 to 24. During this period of time, the number of Kansans in this age group has increased by about 30,000, which is natural when the population grows somewhat every year. Between 2005 and 2017, the number of those age of students who have not completed high school has actually dropped from about 42,000 to 35,000. The percent of the population, or the number of the population that has completed high school and has had no post-secondary education at all, has stayed about the same. but the number of students who have some college up to a 2-year degree has increased by over 30,000, and the number of students who have completed a bachelor's degree or higher by age 24 has increased from about 26,000 to almost 32,000. These improvements in Kansas education levels has had a direct impact on the economy of our state and frankly the prosperity of individual Kansans. We know this because based on the most recent data, and this has been true for a long time, the higher degree of education a person attains, on average the higher salary they will earn. For example, in 2017, Kansans who had not finished high school on average earned about $26,000 a year. Those who graduated high school only, no other post-secondary experience, earned right at $30,000. Those who had a post-secondary training of any kind, any college, technical certificate up to a 2-year degree, earned about $34,000, $35,000 a year. Those with a 4-year degree, just under $50,000, and those with a graduate or professional degree, about $61,000. But because so many more Kansans are now in the higher educated age group, the earnings of the state has increased. In fact, if we compare what Kansans actually earned to what they hypothetically would have earned in 2017 if we were at 1990 education levels, the difference is about $7 billion a year in additional wages and salaries because of the higher education levels within our state. This positive economic impact is true for states in general, not just Kansas. As this chart shows, the higher percent of a state's population has a 4-year college degree or more, the higher per capita income or average income, total income of a state divided all residents is likely to be. And the reverse is also true. The lower percent of the population with a 4-year degree or higher, the more likely that state is to have high rates of poverty. So generally speaking, if a state wants to have high income and lower poverty, one of the most powerful things they can do is increase the education levels of the population. Kansas is at a competitive advantage in these areas. For example, for the population 25 and older, about 90% of Kansans have a high school diploma or more. About 2/3, 65.3%, have had some type of college. This may mean simply starting a program, a technical certificate, a 2-year degree, all the way up to finishing higher degrees. And almost 34% have a 4-year degree or higher. That ranks 17th in the country for high school completion, 9th in the percent of the population with any college, and 14th in the percent with a 4-year degree or more. If you look just at 18 to 24-year-olds, about 88% of Kansans have completed high school or more, ranking 20th. About 59% have started college or completed a post-secondary degree of any kind, ranking 11th. And those that have a BA degree or a 4-year degree or higher, 10.6% would rank 20th. That 10.6% may sound low compared to a 33% completion rate for 25 and older, but remember, 18 to 24 years means all the people in that age group. So that includes 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds who really probably haven't had a chance, unless they're really accelerated, to finish a 4-year degree within that period of time. In fact, every year, KASB gets data from all states and ranks states on 15 different educational outcomes or measures of student performance. We're going to talk more about these in a little while. They fall into 4 different areas, such as educational attainment, 18 to 24, as we've been talking about, graduation rates, national reading and math tests, ACT and SAT tests of preparation for college. But last year, a weighted average of all of these ranks put Kansas 9th in the country, in the top 10 states in performance. And in every case, Kansas ranked in at least the top half of all states. We're going to be updating this, and so if you're looking closely, you may see that some of the values are not the same as previous slides because we haven't updated this section yet. Well, that probably sounds like a lot of good news. And so you may be wondering, well, why is it that the Kansas Supreme Court, for example, has called our funding not suitable? Why is it that some organizations and some state leaders believe our school system is really failing or in some type of crisis? We think there's probably about three reasons. First is that Kansas educational progress, in some measures, has stalled or other states are catching up despite our current lead. The second is there are large disparities among student groups. In other words, some groups of kids lag far behind others, and that was a major concern of the Kansas Supreme Court. And finally, economic and social demands for the educational system are growing as fast or even faster than educational progress we've made so far. Let's start by going back to the information on educational attainment by adults. Remember this chart? It shows that for each category, and for both 25 years and older and 18 to 24, Kansas ranks at least 20th and in other cases higher. However, in every case, the 25 and older population ranks higher than the 18 to 24 population. This suggests that as these younger adults move through the system, it could affect our standing in the older population as well. Now let's look at high school graduation rates. First, understand that this is not the same as the percent of population who has completed high school in a certain age group. Instead, this is called the adjusted cohort graduation rate, and it looks at what percent of students who have entered as freshmen have graduated from high school within 4 years or on time. This is a pretty new way of calculating graduation rates. And note that from 2011 to 2013, the Kansas rate improved from about 81% to 86%, but was then essentially flat, no improvement at all until 2016, until it began moving up again, but a little slower than earlier in 2017 and 2018. However, the national average for this statistic has basically been improving steadily this whole time, closing some of the gap between Kansas and the rest of the country. The dotted lines look just at low-income students, those eligible for free and reduced lunch. Note that Kansas did improve from about 72 to 76% between 2011 and 2012, kept improving, but at a slower rate through 2016 and a little bit better in 2017. However, the rest of the country was again steadily improving and has essentially caught up with Kansas. Next, let's turn to a measure called the National Assessment of Education Progress. This is a test of students in reading and math. You might think of it as a test of basic skills, but there's a couple of important limitations. It's only given to a small sample of students in every state. We have a state score in Kansas and other states, but we don't have individual district or school building or student scores to look at. It's given in reading and math only, every other year, and we can look at a combination of 4 test scores, 4th and 8th grade, reading and math, as a way of measuring performance. There's basically 2 levels to look at. One is called basic. You might think of this as sort of the minimum level of being on grade level, perhaps a predictor roughly of graduation. So think of this as a certain lower standard, but does measure a type of basic skills. Between 2003 and 2009, the average Kansas score on these 4 tests increased from about 74% to 80%. Stayed level to 2011, but has dropped back down to about 74% in 2017. Over this same period of time, the U.S. average has been growing steadily but slowly to a point where the rest of the country has just about caught up with Kansas. A second and higher benchmark of achievement on the NAEP is called proficient. You might think of this as more of a predictor of being on track to be prepared for college. Here in Kansas, we saw an increase from about 36% to 40% from 2003 to 2011. But through 2017, that had dropped back down to 38%. Meanwhile, the U.S. average has increased from just under 30% to about 34%, slightly ahead of Kansas. Now let's turn to a measure of readiness for college. To do this for Kansas, we'll look at information from the ACT test. That's the dominant test in Kansas. About 75% of students take the ACT as a junior or senior. In about half the states, ACT is the primary test. The rest of the states, it's the SAT. But this does allow us to compare Kansas to a national average. If you go back to 2006, about 25% of Kansans scored at what ACT calls the college-ready level, meaning a high chance of being successful in introductory college courses in the 4 subjects of English, math, reading, and science. That increased pretty steadily up to 32% in 2015. However, from 2015 to 2017, that dropped back down to 29% and stayed that way through 2018. Nationally, there was a fairly similar pattern of improvement, some falling back, but overall the gap does seem to have narrowed somewhat. It is important to remember that although only about a third and now about 29% of students have scored college ready in all 4 areas, that's also a fairly tough standard. About 70% or more of kids score ready in English, about 50% are college ready in math and reading, and about 40% in the area of science. However, to have the best chance of success in college, the more areas a student demonstrates college readiness on, the better. Finally, let's look at a new measure developed by the Kansas State Department of Education to track how well districts are doing in preparing students for post-secondary progress, and that's what this report is called. It's based on 3 things. First of all, looking at a 5-year average of graduation rates, which through 2016 was 86%, comparing that to a 5-year, what was called success rate, which is the percent of graduates who, within 2 years, have either finished a degree program or are still enrolled in a degree program. So they may have finished a 1 or 2 year certificate or degree, or they're still enrolled in a program. That's called the success average. The graduation rate is multiplied by the success average to produce what's called the effective average. The purpose of that is so that we're actually looking at the percent of the graduating class, not just those students who've actually graduated. The state board's goal is to get to a graduation rate of 95% and an effective rate of 70 to 75%, because that's the estimate of the percent of jobs in the next few years that are likely to require something beyond high school. There's always a lag in this because we're waiting for data 2 years after the graduating class. But from 2012 through 2016, as we've talked about, graduation rate hadn't moved very much. However, the success rate, in other words, the percent of students who were still enrolled, or had completed a program within 2 years, had increased from a little over 50% to approaching 60%, an average of 54%. And that meant gradual improvement in the 5-year effective rate. So let's wrap this up with some final thoughts. First of all, it's clear from the data that Kansas schools have always been improving over time, and in most ways, schools are doing better than they ever have before in terms of student success. At the same time, they're always falling short because our educational expectations keep rising. Social demands, the demands of the job market, improvements in other states. Second, it's important to understand that students are very different, but we want the same results for all students. On all the measures we've looked at, there are big gaps between some students and other student groups, low income, disabled, some minority groups, homeless students, students of migrant family backgrounds, all tend to do less than other students. Yet we want to try to overcome that, and we'll need to if we want to raise performance. Third factor is that resources do matter because funding helps overcome some of those differences. Some of the reason education increases is because of additional funding for special education, or additional programs started at at-risk students, or more money added to try to make school environments safer. What we've seen is that over time, educational funding has tended to grow in Kansas. That's been the norm, and we've seen educational improvement. In roughly the last 10 years, however, education funding has not kept up with inflation for a variety of reasons. That's been when we've seen over those years the leveling off or the slowing down of improvement that we've seen before. But it's also important to acknowledge that resources alone are not enough. It's important to also set higher goals, try to find ways to redesign schools to reach students who are not being successful, and promote more individualized ways to meet the needs of students. And that's the goal and the purpose of the Kansas State Board of Education's Kansans Can vision. With the slogan that Kansas leads the world in the success of every student, Kansas schools are working hard to continue to demonstrate that improvement, overcome the differences among student groups, and make sure Kansas students are prepared to face their challenges in higher education or post-secondary education and in the workforce. Thanks for your interest in this, and if you have questions, you can contact me, Mark Tallman, mtallman@kasb.org.